I'm Reuveni, and over the summer my research was investigating the effect of cognitive load on the interaction between the procedural and the declarative system. And I'd like to start off by talking a bit about these two systems. On the one hand, we have the declarative system, which deals with learning facts and how-tos. For example, how to learn a recipe. This system is very good at proposing and testing hypotheses. And if there's a relatively simple rule that governs a certain task, the declarative system will pick up on that rule. On the other hand, we have the procedural system, or the implicit system. This system is characterized by a slower, more deliberate learning, which is critically dependent upon feedback. Some examples of procedural learning is how to ride a bike. It's a slow, deliberate process that requires trial and error. And this system is generally used to learn rules that are more complex and not necessarily available to consciousness. For example, you couldn't read a manual or write a manual on how to ride a bike. It's something that you actually have to do. And I'd also like to take a moment to point out the neural substrate of these two systems. The declarative system is thought to mostly occur in the prefrontal cortex, whereas the procedural system is thought to occur primarily in the basal ganglia and striatum. And it's important to point this out because these two systems are occurring in separate areas of the brain, and so they can interact in non-trivial ways and work independently as well. So why is all this important? Well, imagine you have a task that requires a behavioral output. For example, pressing a key on a keyboard or pointing to one thing or another. Well, the motor cortex generates this action. However, how does the motor cortex decide what action to take? Well, it could listen to the declarative system. For example, when learning or baking a cake, for example, following a recipe, the declarative system might inform you as to which spice or utensil to reach for next. On the other hand, it could listen to the procedural system. For example, when you're riding a bike and you want to take a turn, the procedural system might inform you on what actions to take. And that's fine and well as long as both systems are working independently of one another. However, the optimal strategy on certain tasks require that both systems be active simultaneously, or rather in rapid succession. And this is called system switching. It turns out that in humans, system switching is very difficult, and only around 22% of people can actively system switch, and even then only under very tightly constrained conditions. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out that when the declarative system and the procedural system are active, the declarative system actively interferes with the procedural system's ability to speak to the motor cortex. And my research over the summer was attempting to lessen or get rid of this interference. The way I went about that was by hypothesizing or suggesting to add an additional task to the declarative system's workload. Meaning, if we add a task that is not related to learning, that taps into the same area that the declarative system taps, the prefrontal cortex, we might rob it of resources that it would use to inhibit the procedural system. Now, I went about this by devising an experiment that is composed of 3 parts. The first part is a categorization task. In a categorization task, people are shown stimuli that vary on several dimensions. For example, we use circular sine wave gratings that varied on 2 dimensions, bar thickness and bar orientation. And participants' job was to learn how to categorize a specific stimuli into either category A or category B. Now, those stimuli were subdivided into 2 groups. One group was to be learned declaratively, and so relied on only one simple rule, whether the bars were thick or thin. So thick bars might be category A, thin bars might be category B. The procedural set of stimuli were more complicated and relied both on bar thickness and bar orientation in order to categorize them. Here, in fact, the rule is governed by an equation. If the bar thickness is greater than the orientation, then it is one category, and if not, then it is another. This is a rule that participants can learn, yet if you show, at the end of it, if you show them a new stimuli, they would not necessarily be able to tell you why it would go into category A or B, but they would nonetheless be able to categorize them. So here's a basic trial design. you see a response-terminated stimulus, meaning you press A or B to make your decision. Then you get visual feedback. Then a fixation cross, which focuses your attention. And then this iterates hundreds of times in order to allow you to learn. These are typical results. You can see the solid line is the declaratively learned set. In our example, thick bars or thin bars. Participants learn it very quickly and achieve a very high level of accuracy that maintains throughout. The procedural set is a dotted line, in our case bar thickness and bar orientation. And as you can see, it's a slower, more deliberate learning. And if we were to run this on, the two accuracies would normalize, meaning the procedural system can become just as accurate. It just takes longer to learn. Now that's the first part of the experiment. The second part is the manipulation, and this was a memory task. In this memory task, it's very simple. We show you a word. On the next trial, we show you a different word, and your job is to decide whether or not the second word is the same or different than the first. If it's the same, you press one key. If it's different, you press another. The reason that we chose this is based on previous research. We can see a declaratively learned set, for example, bar thickness, is learned very quickly on its own. And when we add a concurrent task, in our case the memory task, it suddenly takes a lot longer to learn. And this is because the memory task is drawing upon the same resources that the declaratively learned task does. It activates the prefrontal cortex. On the other hand, you can see a procedurally learned set relies on a different system, the basal ganglia. And when you add a concurrent task, the difference is not significant. And so we chose this task because it selectively interferes with the declarative system and not with the procedural system. So that's the manipulation. The third part of the experiment was the test. It was our way to check if two systems were being used in order to categorize or just one. And we do this by a button switch. A button switch is exactly what it sounds like. If you were using, for example, one button to press category A and another button to press category B, now you have to use the reverse. You don't swap hands, but now B is on your left and A is on your right. And it turns out that when you do a button switch, declaratively learned stimuli take no hit to accuracy. And that makes sense. If you're using your left for A and right for B, now you're using your right for A and your left for B. You do take a small hit to reaction time, but your accuracy remains the same. However, the procedurally learned set takes a big hit to accuracy. And in order to illustrate why, you can think of trying to use a mouse upside down. If you've ever tried it, you'll know that while it might seem easy in practice, in theory, instead of moving up, you move down, and instead of moving down, you move up. In practice, it's awkward for the first few moments. Or for example, if you ever try to manipulate a comb or a razor in the mirror, you'll notice that awkwardness. And this is because the procedural system tends to map certain behaviors to certain decisions. And when you change those behaviors, it takes a while to remap those pathways. And so these are the results we would expect to see if people are using two systems. We would expect to see no accuracy hit in the declarative set and a big accuracy hit in the procedural set. If they were just using one system, for example, just the declarative system, then we would see no hit to accuracy regardless of stimuli. So this is the actual experiment. These are screenshots. You see a fixation cross, and you see a word, and then a stimulus. This colored rectangle just tells you whether or not the stimulus you're seeing is from the declarative set or the procedural set. In this case, blue is declarative, so you only have to consider bar thickness. So you might decide that thin bars are B. You make a decision, you get feedback, and then we move on. This is the memory task. 10 is different than 6, and so you would press different, and you move on. Green means this is a procedural stimuli. You have to take into account both bar thickness and bar orientation. You make a decision, you get feedback, and you move on. And so that was the experiment. Now let's talk about results. This is a bit of a busy graph, but I'll walk through it step by step. The yellow bar is the memory task. And as you can see, it takes a while for participants to learn. But after that, they retain a fairly high level of accuracy. And this is important because we need to make sure that our participants are actively engaged in the manipulation. The green bar is the declarative set. And as you can see, it agrees with the results that I showed before. With a concurrent task, it takes longer to learn. These are blocks of 50, so it takes about 100 trials for them to reach peak accuracy, and then it remains fairly stable. The black line is a combination of the green and the purple, and the purple line is the procedural set, both bar thickness and orientation. And as you can see, it hovers around 50%, which basically means that people are guessing. It's 50-50. The last part of this graph are between blocks 10 and 12. As you can see, that's the button switch phase. And you can see that the procedural system makes no difference. If they were guessing before, they're still guessing now. And the declarative system shows this reversal. It was around 0.7, then it goes to around 0.3, which seems to indicate to us that people were just misapplying the rule. They were not actually button switching when the experiment buttons were in fact switched. And so then we attribute that to poor instruction, and we'll have to look into that more. But the really surprising result is there is no evidence for procedural learning. Now, why might that be? Well, remember this, motor cortex can listen to either the declarative or the procedural system. And when the declarative system and the procedural system are active at the same time, the declarative system interferes with procedural expression. Well, my hypothesis was that by giving the declarative system a task that was unrelated to learning, we might rob it of resources needed to interfere with the procedural system. However, it could very well be the case that any activity in the declarative system would simply increase interference with the procedural system, and no distinction between activity directed towards a learning task or general activity is observed. And so it would lead, instead of from this to this, from this to this. And that accounts for our results nicely. That's just one possible explanation. And another explanation is that there could be factors that we just don't know that are influencing these results. And that's perfectly fine, because it means that more research is required. And that's what makes this field so exciting and interesting. There's so much we don't know and so much still left to learn. And so that's where my experiment is at this point. In conclusion, I'd like to thank Dr. Matthew Crossley, who was my mentor on this project, Professor Richard Ivry, in whose lab I work, Professor Gregory Ashby from UC Santa Barbara that collaborated with me on this experiment, UC Berkeley in the SURF program, Nathan, who's our point man throughout the summer, and Leah Carroll, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this all possible. And I'll take any questions. Thank you.